Ace Combat, or Air Combat. English names always made it a bit confusing. What began as a PlayStation port of Namco's 1993 Air Combat ended up transforming into a whole new game of its own, and thus replacing that boring Air with a cool Ace. In Japan, at least. I'm a big fan of the Ace Combat series, so I figured a fun side project to do would be talking about each game in order of release. And yes, that means we'll be taking time for Air Combat here. No, the arcade one. Well, the first one's more of a footnote. It doesn't really emulate well enough in MAME for me to judge its quality on any level. From what I can grasp, it's neat, but slight. It plays well, but lacks for proper mission design. Or missions at all. The game is largely just based around you flying around a small open environment and shooting down enemy aircraft in sequence. More sold on how impressive it was than anything else. It does look pretty cool, I gotta admit, even in this fucked up emulated version where the sky suddenly turns red when you die. Maybe that makes it look cooler. Air Combat 22 is a bit more substantial. You get some short group fights against guys who have a shit ton of chaff, and then move over to bomb this carrier. Grand finale is a 1v1 dogfight I had written down in the script previously that I could not beat, but I actually just beat it on this run. Huh. Well, can't say it wasn't worth it for an ending this stylish. Anyway, they're neat, but not quite Ace Combat. Not as we know it. More like the Ace Combat gestation stage. They're fun, but more like short little attractions meant to wow you with their 3D graphics than anything else. No, in terms of mission structure and aesthetic, the PS1 game is where Ace Combat was born. According to designer Masanori Kato, while they were given the initial task of porting the arcade game to PS1, the team felt under-equipped for it. They had no plane experts on the team, just someone who was into naval ships. And the PS1's hardware didn't feel equipped for the task. In his words, "In the end, we just decided to forget about creating a port, and instead made a game from scratch." So instead, Air Combat became Ace Combat. They retooled the game around a mission-based structure and rebalanced it for longer play sessions rather than rapid-fire quarter-munching. That's enough intro. Let's talk about the actual game already. Honestly, I've always had a soft spot for this game's title screen. Really love the bright blue sky and clouds drifting off in the background.
Gentlemen, you are the cream of the world's air forces. This country
The story of Ace Combat does not quite exist yet. You're super plane man, you got hired for your super plane skills, the country of Usia is in the middle of an insurrection being waged in the Scully Islands, and you gotta go shoot the terrorists and stop it. This marks Ace Combat as the beginning of the Strangereal setting, which is something that'll become more relevant later. Right now, it's not much more than a fictional country to set their arcade plane game in, to avoid grounding it in any real-world conflict. Real planes, strange lands. Guess that's why they call it Strangereal.
Ready? Break now! Enemy locked on target. Fire! Shoot him down! Stay with him! Bingo! Yahoo!
Game doesn't make the worst first impression, at least. Graphics are early 3D. Planes look decent, if a bit clippy, courtesy of Namco's early understanding of the PS1 3D graphics. But thanks to the game's bright colors, it's at least not too hard on the eyes. Not a fan of the paint job you get forced to use, but I guess it makes your plane stand out. Things are a bit rougher for the environments, though. That's the real hit here. The ground is very lacking in clear detail. Not for lack of texture work, it feels like they prioritized giving texture to the ground over having clearly defined 3D environments. This makes it a little awkward to judge where you are in relation to the map sometimes. Not always a huge problem, but it's more of a problem than it ever would be in the later games. It's also not exactly consistent about this. Some maps feature blocky enclosed spaces with butt-ugly texture work slapped on top. Some are very wide open spaces with virtually nothing on the ground to convey anything more than an idea of the space to the player. I prefer the latter for how trippy it looks. There is kind of a charm to these specific maps. If I had to say what looks best, I'd probably say these nighttime city levels. The blocky geometry best fits these large buildings, and the small, colorful lights dotting the environment create a convincing illusion of space, while also just looking pretty. AC1 isn't the prettiest Namco game on PS1. Ridge Racer managed a much more arcade-accurate and generally pleasant to look at PS1 ports, almost a year earlier. But hey, it was 1995, and the best looking stuff to compare it to was Jumping Flash and Wipeout. Ace Combat 1 predates the PS1 receiving any sort of analog controller, flight stick, or DualShock. As such, this is the only Ace Combat game that strictly uses 8-directional digital movement, and the only one where I've opted to use the simple flight controls as a result. Okay, well, you actually can use Namco's NegCon for this game. The NegCon is meant more for driving games, but in this case it allows us the power of analog rolling. I don't have a NegCon exactly, but you can easily map an analog controller to read out NegCon inputs in Duckstation. Here's how that looks in action. It's a bit closer to how later games control, but you're still locked to digital inputs for turning up or down, so it's not quite ideal. We'll be using the basic controls for this playthrough. It feels a fair bit less responsive than its sequels, but not awful. The basics are all here, and as long as you have an aircraft with good mobility, movement feels good enough for the game to be a fun enough time. Mission design starts off very simple, but if you progress a bit, some of the later ones are slightly more interesting and memorable. The series' first canyon run is a basic one, but it works fine, even if the canyon kinda looks like butt. The desert mission, where you've got to follow oil pipelines to reach and destroy each end of the refinery, is pretty slow, but it's a decent change of pace. It's the other early game mission that sticks out in my memory. In general, the dogfighting in AC1 is, fun enough for how simple it is. There's no real big, iconic aerial duels here, no notable 1v1 boss fights, or even characters that you bump heads with. AC1 is as arcadey as it gets, so it lacks a bit of punch here as a result. I guess if you wanted to get that out of it, you'd just have to go over to the 1v1 multiplayer mode. Not that I had anyone to play that with. There are a couple missions that kinda highlight a big problem with how AC1's low graphical fidelity interferes with its playability, though. First one is this mission over the water, where you gotta bomb these boats, which are equipped with SAM launchers. Common occurrence in later games, and in AC1 the formation is comically simple, but I had a hard time even seeing the missiles the SAMs were firing, let alone dodging them. The missiles the SAMs were firing? I mean the SAMs? Whatever. It came back to be a problem with the final boss. The requisite shoot down a huge-ass aircraft mission that every good AC game has. This guy doesn't just have his own missile launchers, he's got 4 regenerating ones. If you don't take them out lightning quick and then destroy the rest of the boss before they can heal, you're going to get shot down in seconds by missiles that are very tricky to see or react to. Not that hard, just annoying to really get a grip on what's even killing you here. All in all, AC1's gameplay is competent. It works, largely thanks to the game's very short playtime, clocking in at roughly an hour and a half if you're speedy. Without a ranking system, branching paths, or secret missions, from there AC1 is just a game you'll have to replay for the sake of it, I guess. You could work on buying every plane, maybe, there's a pretty big selection of them, but with the game lacking any special weapons like chaff or the specialty missiles, there's not too much to set them all apart. And make sure you don't die on a mission or you lose one. Or just save before every mission and reload that save when you die, it only takes a few seconds. Of course, you can also hire wingmen. I did that a couple times. Didn't really notice a difference. Maybe they just helped to keep a guy off my back. Not sure there needs to be like 16 of them. The most notable thing about Ace Combat as a whole is probably its soundtrack. In stark contrast to later Ace Combat music, AC1's musical identity is primarily based in a mix of rock and synth, putting it more in line with, but still somewhat distinct from, other earlier PlayStation-era Namco soundtracks like Ridge Racer. At this point, the series was still leading more in the direction of a Top Gun riff, so I guess that much makes sense. This particular soundtrack comes courtesy of composers Nobuhide Isayama, or Satsuki, and Masako Ogami, or Rose, as well as guitarist Kazutaka Fujimoto. Isayama had a brief period working for Namco in this era, also doing the music for Ridge Racer Revolution the same year, alongside Hiroshi Okubo, of course, while Ogami would end up leaving the Ace Combat team from here on to do music for more of Namco's sports titles, Smash Court, and her biggest role would be music direction on the underappreciated 7 Molmorth no Kiheitai, as well as her return composing cutscene tracks for its sequel, Venus and Braves, written by Sawako Natori, who would later go on to write on the Drakengard and Nier series. Overall, the music in AC1 is solid, but it is a bit samey after a while. I think it could benefit from more diversity in style. That's just a nitpick, though. If you want some butt-ass rock to rock out to while blowing stuff up in the air, the music's just fine. On a more minor note, Ace Combat 1 had 3 English voice actors they grabbed. 2 of them don't seem to have returned to games after, but one, Daniel Dressner, did get a few roles in some very forgotten, very 2005 games. Overhead street fighting beat-em-up, Crime Life, Gang Wars, and the Czech stealth game, Chameleon. Huh. AC1 is cute. That's about all there is to say about it. Kind of a case of Street Fighter 1 syndrome, I guess. It's that first entry that doesn't quite know where it's going yet. One of those games you play for a couple hours, have a decent bit of fun with, and probably don't think much of ever again. The presentation's got its unique mid-90s Namco arcade charms, especially bolstered by its upbeat and fun soundtrack, and there's some cute extras like this hidden alternate load screen where you can enter little cheat codes that get represented by these iconic Namco arcade sprites. One of them lets you play this silly little minigame in place of the other 2 load screens. That's neat. Do I love AC1? I'm probably not gonna play it again, but that's fine. Some games have to walk before they can fly. Going back to that earlier interview with Masanori Kato, this is what he had to say about the experience of making this first game. Now that I look back on the project, it allowed us to return to the basics of being professional creators, making games that are fun from the point of view of the user. It was a project that stimulated me in a very positive way. This stimulation definitely left the team itching for another shot at this style of game, and it wouldn't be long before they'd get it.